Okay, hello everybody. My name is Lindsay Harris, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Associate Dean of Clinical and Experiential Programs at UDC Law. I direct our Immigration and Human Rights Clinic. This is our second event this semester in the Conversations with Clinicians series. We've had some amazing conversations over the last year or so, which are available on our website, and we'll put a link in the chat for you all if you're hoping to catch some of the previous conversations. The idea behind this series is that we feature our own UDC law clinicians in conversations with leaders in the experiential education field. Our school in particular was an early leader in clinical legal education, and we teach at a school where all of our students take between 10 and 14 mandatory clinic credits as a graduation requirement. So we are hoping here to create a space where clinicians across the country can engage in topics of interest, along with thinking through some of the most pressing issues that face our community. So as I said before we hopped on camera, we typically have cameras off until the end, and then we will ask you to join us on screen if you'd like to, or unmute. But we have our guests kind of engage in conversation that we can all witness and then share our thoughts at the end. So today, I'm thrilled to have my colleague and our general practice clinic co-director, Andy Budzinski, in conversation with Professor Gautam Hans of Cornell Law. I'll introduce them both quickly and then hand it over to Professor Budzinski. So in the general practice clinic here at UDC Law, currently, Professor Budzinski, or Andy, works with students to represent survivors of intimate partner violence in accessing justice in the District of Columbia. He has taught in various capacities with clinics at George Washington University, Georgetown Law, and Washington and Lee. He's also served as a law clerk with the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. Andy's scholarship focuses on access to justice for self-represented litigants in state court. Specifically, he writes about how court rules disadvantage litigants without counsel and how those rules can be modified to maximize procedural fairness. He's involved with training for the DC Affordable Law Firm, and he served as a faculty presenter for the DC Bar for CLE's continuing legal education sessions on civil protection order litigation. He edits the bar's practice manual chapter on DV also, and for several years he served as an organizer of the Mid-Atlantic Clinicians Writing Workshop Series. I will also highlight that for those of you who are at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Clinicians Conference, the first one ever, to be continued annually, he just presented a fantastic paper on thinking through some of the challenges of clinic in the cloud, right? How do we deal with some of the most challenging tech issues and protect our clients' data and privacy in the kind of remote and non-remote lawyering space that we find ourselves in today? So we'll add his bio into the chat. But Professor Budzinski will be in conversation with Professor Gautam Hans. So Gautam is an associate clinical professor of law and associate director of the First Amendment Clinic at Cornell. He's an expert on First Amendment law and tech policy. He analyzes through research and advocacy the legal and policy issues implicating technology and civil liberties. He also researches and works on issues related to clinical legal education, and that's really where we'll focus some of the conversation today, particularly focusing on social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as a leader in the national clinical community, Gautam serves currently as co-president of the Clinical Legal Education Association, CLEA, and also on the board of the Center for Study of Applied Legal Education, CSAIL, and on the advisory board of the Initiative for a Representative First Amendment. Prior to entering academia, he worked at the Center for Democracy and Technology in DC and in San Francisco for 4 years, focusing on privacy, free speech, and surveillance law and policy. Before he joined Cornell, where he is now, he served as an associate clinical professor of law and founding director of the Vanderbilt Stanton Foundation First Amendment Clinic. And he also, before that, completed his clinical teaching fellowship at the University of Michigan Law School. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Andy Budzinski, and I will hop on at the end and just tell you in a couple minutes about our 2 remaining events for this semester. So thank you all for being with us today, and a huge thank you to both of our guests for joining us and spending some of their Friday with us today.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I'll add my own good afternoon to everyone who's joining us. I am also thrilled to have the chance to be in conversation with Gautam today, not only because of the expertise that he brings in the DEI space as it relates to clinic hiring, but also because we went to law school together. So go blue. Gautam, I guess to kick us off, since you have written extensively about pathways to clinical education and some of the barriers that our traditional access points to clinical teaching present. So I thought we might start just with your own path to clinical teaching and sort of whether you knew you wanted to be a clinic professor, was it an unplanned progression? And then, how are you reflecting on that path now?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Thanks, Lindsay, and to UDC for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I was in law school. I started almost 15 years ago and went not with a lot of planning, but I had planned to get my doctorate in English literature, and then I chickened out. So I went to law school instead, like I think people used to do more of. And hopefully people go to law school with a little more intentionality than I did. But I think as a result, academia was always something that I think I had an interest in, although I don't think I planned to go into legal academia. I sort of thought that was behind me. And then when I got to law school and was not very good at it, I definitely didn't think I was going to be a legal academic. I had a lot of interest in the substantive areas I work on technology issues, but I didn't necessarily think that was going to take me into teaching. I thought I would go into public interest work. And was a public interest student throughout law school. And then when I was at Michigan, where I went to law school, they have a really, a very strong clinical program, and have these 7-credit clinics, which end up being like a big part of your experience if you end up enrolling. And I actually really enjoyed clinic. Annie and I both had the wonderful Kim Thomas as a clinical supervisor, and she was one of many people. I'm sure others are familiar with some other clinical folks at Michigan. I had as teachers David Santa Croce, Paul Reingold, who retired, Dana Thompson, just some really great clinical teachers. And I really loved the work, and I felt at home in clinic in a way that I didn't feel at home in contracts, right? Where I just didn't feel like I was particularly good at it. So I think that I thought, I would love to go into clinical teaching, but it seemed like it didn't seem like there was a lot of avenues towards it, or I wasn't really sure how you did it. And also because my interest is in technology law and policy, at the time there weren't that many clinics that worked on that area. So I think I thought, well, that's maybe the end goal, but not necessarily the that's maybe not something I'm going to actively work towards from graduation. And so I went into, work at this nonprofit called the Center for Democracy and Technology, which Lindsay mentioned. And, one of the benefits of that job was that it was sort of like a think tank, although they would hate if I had said that, because we did more advocacy work. It wasn't just a research organization, but we did have a lot of interaction with academics, both clinical and non-clinical, who worked on free speech, privacy, surveillance, copyright. And so I think I was in a very sort of intellectually engaged environment for someone who was an attorney, because usually when you're an attorney, you're much more focused on, client services, and we didn't really have clients. We used to say our public was the client. It was much more of a policy organization than a legal organization, to the degree that those two things are distinct. But, and I sort of started to get a sense of people serving clinical fellowships. My dear friend Priya Bhaskaran had been a clinical fellow at Georgetown when I was at CDT. I knew some other people who had done clinical fellowships. Some of the clinics I was interested in were offering fellowships. And I don't know if I've talked about this, but I was actually a very unsuccessful clinical fellow applicant. I think I applied to at least 5 to 7 and was a finalist multiple times and did not get a clinical fellowship. I could not get someone to hire me, which, I have a bad habit of taking things personally. And so I definitely thought that was I felt very conflicted about it. And so what ended up happening was that I actually got a fellowship at Michigan, where I went to school. I guess I'm a Nepo baby in some ways, right? It probably was a bit of an inside track, because David Santa Croce was the clinical dean at the time, and he had created this fellowship program, and he had my student. I ended up teaching as a fellow in the clinic that I had been in. So that I think kind of also gave me some mixed feelings, which I think if people have read the piece that I wrote in the Clinical Law Review a couple of years ago, I think you can probably sense my ambivalence. And even at the time, ambivalence. Because the other piece of it I think is really important to note is that I did not graduate with debt. I had a really, my parents are doctors. There was a lot of financial privilege in how I grew up. I did not have debt. I was a public interest person who didn't have debt, which is very rare. I went to a very elite law school, and I am single, active, but perpetually single, aggressively single, and I don't have kids, right? And so all these things I think probably feed into the piece. But it was really easy for me to take a very low-paying job, like a $50,000 a year job, the lowest salary I'd had since before law school, because even as a public interest attorney, I made a little more than that when I started out. And so I think that's the other piece of it that I don't think I knew was going to be like expected or like de rigueur for fellowships. And that's how I went into teaching. So I was only in practice for 4 years, which I think is, I was talking to someone about this, like probably, I think relatively on the low end, and maybe I think probably about as low as you can go without it, I think, being an issue for clinical fellows. From my view, I think that's a matter of opinion, but that's sort of how it all started.
So you've touched on a lot of the pieces of what led you to write the 2021 CLR article. And for those who aren't familiar with it, I wonder if you could just sort of talk a little bit about that piece and what your endeavor was, and then kind of what led you to start writing it.
Yeah, and I'll drop it in the chat. I'm just pulling up the link now. This is actually the SSRN, but I think it's hopefully people can access it. So when I joined the CLIA board in 2019, the beginning of 2019, and I joined the Faculty Equity and Inclusion Committee, and we worked on a paper that we published in CLR as a Faculty Equity and Inclusion Committee that I think Caitlin Berry, who is now immediate past co-president, teaches at Villanova, and I had taken sort of the lead on writing. And so that was about racial and gender equity and the lack of progress since John Dubin had written his article for CLR, I think, in the early 2000s. So this was for an anniversary CLR issue where we were talking about sort of the long running themes of clinical scholarship. And in the process of writing that article, I read Mira Deo's book, Unequal Profession, which I think some people may be familiar with. Mira's wonderful. I'm thrilled that this work has brought me into friendship with her, because I think Unequal Profession is just such a great book for people who are in legal academia, who are experiencing issues around race and gender in terms of their own identities, and how schools have challenges, really including particularly women of color, into their ranks. But Mira's book really focuses on doctrinal, what we call doctrinal research, podium faculty, I think stand-up faculty. There's all sorts of terms for this. They're very politicized. I use doctrinal despite dint of habit. I think some people use other terms. So I was interested, based on Mira's book, based on this CLR CLIA article that we wrote, if part of the problem is we have real problems in representation and in supporting faculty of color and women faculty. Well, why is that? We're a community that I think really likes to talk about ourselves as social justice advocates, as committed public interest lawyers, but we're not necessarily being inclusive. What is that? Like, why are people not having problems getting in if they want to get in? And there are all sorts of reasons why people might not want to be clinical faculty. There's also downsides to it too. So one of the things that I thought of was like, well, how do people become clinical faculty? I'm looking around. I see a lot of people who have done fellowships or had staff attorney stints. I mean, Andy, you and I both did clinical fellowships, which I think we both would say were not particularly remunerative, and require some sacrifices, not just in terms of money, but in terms of lots of other things. Yeah. And what are the dynamics of that? And so that was what drove me to write this piece. And I sort of jokingly alluded to some self-loathing, but I think that's really part of it. I think I had a lot of ambivalence about looking around and seeing a lot of people who either wanted to be clinicians, but couldn't, or didn't even think about it because they realized the barriers were really high. And then I, sort of the wealthy, graduate of an elite law school, lots of financial privilege, lots of ability to move around. I mean, I've moved a lot as an attorney, and that's because I could, right? So like, why is it that I was able to succeed when other people who I think have as much or more to offer have more challenges? So that's sort of what came to me. And I had presented it at the CLR workshop. I think it was in the fall of 2020 when it was online for the first time, and I got some really good responses. And I want to actually, I think I owe a thanks publicly to Margaret Johnson, because she had, who teaches at UB, the University of Baltimore. She, I think had really good feedback for me on the challenges that I was identifying, but also because of some of the timing with CLR, they actually were looking for a piece, and Randy Hertz, who's editor-in-chief, said, if you can write this in a very compressed period, we can publish it. And I thought that would be great. I feel like this is a good time to get this out in the world. And so it was a bit of a time crunch in the depths of the pandemic when we weren't doing anything else anyway. So I was able to do that. But and that's sort of how it came to light and came to publication 2 years ago.
Yeah. So there's this interesting, and just in hearing you talk about sort of the structural barriers that the fellowship pathway can present to folks, right? But also, as you write about in the essay, that there's just kind of a lack of data about it, actually. We don't really have a good way to think about what the pathways are and how successful or not they are in improving DEI. And I guess it just makes me think of whether we're practicing what we preach, both in whether we're achieving DEI, whether we're striving to it, in the first instance, whether we're tracking our success on that metric. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that finding.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that the piece does a lot of things, maybe too many things, but one of the things that I was interested in was like numbers, right? Like how do we figure out what the correlation is between having done a fellowship or some kind of prior teaching experience and getting an entry-level job. And so, I talked about Kyun and David Santacroce, who are co-chairs, co-presidents, co-leaders of CSAIL. And this is actually, it reminded me, if you have not done your CSAIL survey yet, please do it. It is very important for us to do the CSAIL survey. I'm on the board and I feel like I have to emphasize this. But, Bob was like, we don't have really good questions or good answers on this front. And that's actually part of the reason that for those who have done the survey, there are now some more questions. And that was partially because I think because they knew that I was interested in this stuff, they asked me to be on the board, and we included these questions now in the survey. So that's CSAIL didn't have a great handle on it. I don't think the programs, there are some schools that hire staff attorneys or fellows on a sort of ad hoc basis when they have funding or there might be a need or something else has come up. But there are some schools that have very regularized fellowship programs. I think, NEU, the Georgetown Fellowship, I went to Michigan. AU has a very well-renowned practitioners in residence program, University of Baltimore. I'm probably missing some, but there are many. But I don't think that even those programs necessarily are saying we hire this many people a year, this many people have come through, this many people have gone on to clinical teaching afterwards. And that's not necessarily what they have to do, right? People can go on to do whatever makes sense for them in their careers, but I don't think we have a good sense of that. So what I thought was, what are some things we can figure out publicly, right? I'm not going to go, I wasn't going to sort of recreate the CSAIL survey. So what can I do? And I thought, okay, well, what I can do is try to figure out how many, when law schools hire entry-level clinical faculty, how many of them have prior teaching experience? Mm-hmm. So I literally got the list of every law school and had some really great research support from the Vanderbilt Library. I taught at Vanderbilt at the time. So basically figure out okay, who has started as a clinician within the last, I think it was 4 or 5 years. And if they did they have prior clinical teaching experience in some form? Very broadly defined. So some of that was based on some schools published the CVs of their faculty. Some of it was LinkedIn research. Some of it was me emailing the clinical dean to ask. It was literally this amount of data collection, which I think was a fair amount of work, but I think demonstrated a finding that I was pretty surprised by, that over 60%, I think it's 62% of people who started an entry-level clinical teaching job of any kind, right, assistant clinical professor or assistant professor of law for schools that are unitary, had taught in some form in a clinic. I think I had to look back on how I worded it, but it was high. And Sarah Losky, who's at Northwestern, tracks a lot of this entry-level hiring information for doctrinal people. And so I was trying to get a sense, sort of using similar kinds of criteria that she has developed. I think 60% is really high, right? And not necessarily bad, right? I think there's lots of reasons, and I think I talk about this in the piece, that we want, you learn things on a clinical fellowship program, ideally, that help you become a strong entry-level clinician. But that also means that we're expecting a lot of people, or rather, it's an indicia of success if you take this relatively low-paying job that might require you to move a fair amount. So there's sort of pros and cons of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess as we're thinking about these pathways, I guess one question I have, and you maybe touch on this in terms of how we're collecting data through CSAIL, is where you think we should go from here to both track that data better, which it sounds like you're plugged into very, very intentionally right now, but also just sort of once we get that data, what do we do with it, or what can we start to set up?
Yeah, I think that it would be good for the schools that are like hiring fellows on a regular basis to really publicly say, like, here's what this is, right? We have, like, the program is designed for so many years. Here's what that looks like in terms of, like, do you get a degree? Like, that's what Georgetown gives. Like, do you have a regular, like, class or session that we give you? Like, what is the expectations for teaching load for those fellows? Do we give you research support? Do we, like, support you to go to the clinical conference? You know, like, very nuts and bolts, publicly available information, so people know, like, what is this program about? And also, like, what do we expect, right? Do we expect you to go in the job market? Do we sort of encourage you? Do we sort of, you know, what kinds of support do we give you for that? As well as, you know, obviously, I think salary and benefits is huge. I think, you know, we have a sense of that sort of formally or informally, or when the job postings go up, but, you know, it's not necessarily permanently available. And also, what do people go on to do, right? Like, people go on to take these kinds of clinical or even doctrinal jobs. Some people go from clinical fellowship into a primarily doctrinal teaching job, or people go into, like, we don't necessarily expect that, or here's what other people have done. Do people not complete, right? Like, because sometimes people leave midway through a fellowship, and that can be for all sorts of reasons, not necessarily bad, right? They may just opt out of it, but, like, what's that like? I think there's, you know, there's all sorts of information that I think we can sort of solve in some ways on the CSAIL side, but I think the schools really can and should do more on that front. So that's one piece of it. And I think the other piece of it is, I think that there's obviously a lot that we can do in a fellowship program to help train people, but not every fellowship program is created equal. You know, some programs are much more about ensuring that the clinic is functioning, and others really are about pre-job market training. So I think being very clear about what the expectations are, what the program is going to give you or not give you. So I think I develop a bit of a taxonomy about, like, what the difference is between what I consider a fellow or a staff attorney, because I think those are different jobs. That's something else too that I think we can be really crisp about, so people know what they're supposed to, like, what the school is designing this to do and what it's not designing it to do. And then finally, I think that I personally feel like 60% is a really high number, maybe a too high number, because there are a lot of people who you might want to include, who might want to join this community, that we could, if we think that there's real value that a fellowship program gives, particularly in pedagogical training and understanding how to sort of teach, run, supervise a clinic, we can't say that a fellowship program is the only way to do that, right? Without, like, giving alternative resources or venues for people to understand what that is. So CLIA's Faculty Equity Inclusion Committee is working on this project. You know, obviously the new Clinicians Conference is, you know, gives some of that, but you kind of almost have to be knowing that you're going into that job before you do the new Clinicians Conference, right? We're not opening it to practitioners necessarily. So I think that we can all also do more to help train people outside of the fellowship program if we feel like there's some secret sauce that is useful. And sometimes people, like, just come in without any of that and they get a semester to plan. So if that's happening, I think schools can, like, use that planning semester not just to help give the new clinic director time to get set up for the clinic and stuff, but also to help include that new person, whether or not they've had prior training in teaching, in sort of understanding what the vibe is of clinic at that school and what that looks like. Because having taught at 3 different schools as a clinician, there are lots of differences. And I think that even if you're someone who has taught before as a fellow, you know, you might benefit from some real training even from the school when you join the faculty. That's obviously more work on clinicians who I think are often overextended. And so I understand it's not costless, but I also think that if we want to be true to the values and I think that we espouse, that, you know, we should prioritize that or think about prioritizing that more than we are. And I should also say that this is all very, like, personal experience based. I think there are a lot of schools that are probably doing a lot of this already. So I don't want to, like, accuse people of not having thought of these things beforehand, right? I'm not the first person to say these things. And I think it'd be interesting, I think, in a few years to sort of maybe revisit this and see what has happened and how are we thinking about these dynamics.
Yeah. I mean, anecdotally, first of all, I think my experience matches what you're describing. So of course, there's always exceptions to anecdotal observation, but that it's happening, that we see it happening, to, you know, is enough of a reason to make it central. And I guess what you were just talking about gets to me a little bit towards the 2021 report that the AALS Policy Committee and CLIA put together that you had a huge hand in with respect to DEI and clinical faculty hiring. And so I guess I have sort of two questions around that. One is, what are the values of adjusting and plugging into the existing hiring structure to make change, but also what are the downsides of that? Like, what do we lose by keeping that structure and just trying to work within it?
Yeah, so I think that the document that you're referring to was something that the CLIA FE&I committee worked on in conjunction with the AAOS policy committee. And that was a really fun project to get to work on as a sort of a larger group and sort of think through, like, what is it we're trying to do with this? Because I think many of us sometimes encounter in faculty hiring for clinicians in our school that it's, depending on how the school gives status to clinicians in the first place, there might be a little bit more it might be a little bit more of a Wild West situation, depending on how things are done, if there's a lot of process or not. And I think that as lawyers, we often think that maybe process is going to help iron out some of the potential inequities. And some of this that we talk about in that document is based on, I think, some of the recommendations that Mira had in her book and at the end to sort of promote more equitable hiring practices. So I think that a lot of it starts to resemble what we would expect of any kind of hiring of a faculty position, where we really expect the committee to do an affirmatively positive and like open arms job in terms of getting people in. And I think that's good. I think that makes it clear to the committee members of the school that this has been done in a serious, holistic, rigorous way, that it's not just, oh, we like that person, or we, this person is an alum, or we really want to hire this person's spouse, so we're going to like bring them in to the clinic, all of which I think happen in various ways. And there's all sorts of reasons that happens, and they're not necessarily nefarious. But I think that what this document gets at is a little bit of a larger trend or discussion of the community that goes back decades, long before I even knew what clinic was, which is, how much are we trying to join the professoriate and how much are we trying to disrupt it? And my read historically is that clinicians come into the academy, very much as outsiders, both in stance, but also like affirmatively as outsiders, right? Not wanting to sort of assimilate or blend in. And I think there's like all sorts of dynamics as to why and how that changes. I think the quest for status to some degree has been good, but it has, I think, allowed us to really, earn and demonstrate our value to institutions in ways that are similar to our colleagues who don't teach in clinic. But I think that the quest for status also has created, for some schools and maybe for some people, this idea that we are very similar to the colleagues who don't teach in the clinic, to the doctrinal colleagues, and that maybe means that we're losing our edge, right? Like, this is like a long-running debate. I think I said some of this work in the fellowship piece. And I think that the question of assimilation comes up in all sorts of communities, and I think it's vexed. I think that there's not really a clear answer. For me, I think that it's important to have status for all sorts of reasons. I think it's the way that many schools are moving towards this. I also think that sort of saying that, whoa, we're too much like them and we should maybe not try to be like them and we should be ourselves. As we diversify the clinical community, especially along race, gender, class, sexual orientation, disability status, and the like, it's a little concerning to me that now is the moment when we say that maybe we're doing too much like we're trying too much to be like them, once we're starting to actually see a group of people that's more reflective of the world and the worlds in which we work. And so I would just say that I understand the feelings of those who think that we're trying too much to be like them. But I think that once you start really diversifying the pool of faculty members, that's exactly when we should try to ensure that people are actually be treated equitably more, not to say like, okay, we've done enough, now we can just sort of be happy, or maybe we should just not try to blend in those ways. Because I think that, at least for me, I don't think I've ever blended into anything in my life. Like, even if I were, at a school where I had tenure and was like had some chair or something, I'm pretty sure that I probably, hopefully, would tie into the values that I've been trying to promulgate for the past few years. And I think many of us are in that same position where we think that, yeah, we can criticize these institutions, we understand that they're flawed and maybe they're not even reparable, but I don't think that means that we shouldn't try, because one of the things that's really important to think about is the students, right? What does it mean for the students to see people from different backgrounds, from different approaches, not just teaching in clinic, but teaching things like con law or corporations or evidence, classes where they may not think that they are necessarily going to see that angle.
The point about assimilation is such an important one on so many axes of this question, and what it also makes me think of is sort of avoiding a perception of DEI as sort of just a numbers-based prompt, right? That there's more substantive value to DEI than just saying that you've met it. Which I think sometimes conversations in the academy, both broadly and maybe even in the clinical space, kind of don't raise to the surface in ways that maybe we should. So I guess I wonder if you have thoughts on, it occurs to me, at least for myself, my identity as a queer gay man, very much influences how I am a clinical teacher, right? In my rejection of norms and structures, in my understanding of gender, in sort of thinking about where we disrupt, right? Where we challenge and where I'm going to not take things for granted that might in cis straight culture be taken for granted. It also influences me in ways I feel like I have to try to hide it or tamp it down. I think that's relevant. And then, of course, there's also how the privilege that comes with my whiteness influences the teaching and the harms that can come from that. So I guess I just wonder if you have thoughts on how identity is central and important to clinical teaching as we think about pursuing DEI in this space.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. And I think it plays out in really interesting ways. One of the things that I really benefited from my fellowship, that I was a fellow working for Dana Thompson, who runs the entrepreneurship clinic and the transactional, or at the time ran the entrepreneurship clinic at Michigan, now runs a community development clinic, and also is sort of the head of the transactional clinics program. And she's a Black woman, right? And she's one of the very few Black women on the Michigan faculty. And I think what I really appreciated learning from Dana was that I think that she was very thoughtful, not only about raising these issues, but about being very strategic about how she raised the issues. And one of the things that she said that I remember really clearly was in talking about cross-cultural lawyering, she was very careful about when she introduced that concept and led that class section, because of being very mindful, not just about how the people within the class had to feel comfortable to talk about these issues, particularly at a time when I think the perception of the appetite for them was less than it probably is today, given the murder of George Floyd, all the issues surrounding the anti-CRT work, all sorts of things that have happened with BLM and sort of related issues in the last couple of years. This was 7 years ago now that we had this conversation. But also I think because of her own identity as a Black woman, I think that she really understood that that was something that she had to think about. And I think growing up in a family that was very focused on assimilation, and I'm the only gay person in my immediate family, only queer person, like this idea that just don't call attention to it and you can just be like them, was this very strong message that I think I received both from my family and my community. And so I think I never thought as a result about being careful, because I never thought I had to be. And that, of course, isn't true. And law school is one of the things that taught me that it wasn't true. And then life taught me it wasn't true. And so I think that being thoughtful about that was really important. And now, when I was at Vanderbilt, I taught legal ethics, a very large class. And I also, again, was I think the only gay man of color on the faculty. And so I would walk into the room and I would think about okay, what does this mean, right? They might think, okay, maybe he's in the clinic and that's one thing, but people don't necessarily want to take legal ethics in the first place. And now, there might be some resistance to it. And I always remember some students, would say that I would let people go on a lot in class, and I didn't necessarily shut them down. And I think for me, I was always I don't know if I have the ability to do that, or especially and maybe that was all in my head, or maybe that was something that I was overstating mentally, but I'm in the South, a lot of my students are white, it's probably a little more conservative, not necessarily a ton more, but a little more. And there's all these things that I have to negotiate in my own head. And so that was really mindful. And then I also teach in a First Amendment clinic, which, tends to attract students who I think feel like maybe this is a clinic that isn't going to be as social justice-y or isn't going to have the same kinds of issues. Maybe you get a more conservative student body, maybe you get a different kind of student. I think that you do. And so that means that when I teach certain things, I have to think about how I introduce them so it doesn't seem like it's coming off as an agenda. And I probably don't need to worry about that as much as I do or did. I think also having taught for a number of years, I feel a little bit more confident than I did when I was an entry-level person. I think once I got through my first review, I think I felt a little more relaxed. And now I'm at a different school, so I feel like, okay, well, I clearly have some job mobility, and so I don't necessarily have to be as paranoid as maybe I was. But I think I always think about, is there going to be the student who thinks, well, he's just teaching Derek Bell because he's a gay Indian guy and that's what he cares about. And maybe I should just let that go, but I think I still think about that a little bit, although probably not as much as I used to.
Yeah. No, I identify deeply with the aspects of that are similar for me. I guess that, what all this makes me think about is, and maybe this also relates some to the CLIA ALS report, of the importance of what you talked about in terms of structured supports for entry-level faculty, particularly who aren't cis straight white men, and how we do that in a way that doesn't put the majority lion's share of the burden on people of color on the faculty already. So I wonder if you have thoughts of like what those structures look like that might move us in the right direction on that.
Yeah, I think that it would, first of all, be really great if schools could be more coordinated on how they do hiring, both on the clinical and non-clinical sides, because it's hard to be the only one, or to feel like you're the only one, or to feel like you're coming in to solve a problem that you didn't create. And I think a lot of us can very easily feel that way, particularly now that every school is desperate to hire race people, but also like care about their standards, right? So we were talking earlier about last week, we did a webinar for CLIA's Teaching Justice series about the 303 mandate. And one of the things that we did was did like a simulation where I played the senior tenured faculty member who doesn't care and doesn't want to deal with this. And I think that we all sort of experience that, right? This idea that like, if we hire people who focus on race or gender or other kinds of social difference, that those people are just probably not as good scholars as the other people that get hired. And that's just, first of all, not true. And I think demonstrates a lot of ignorance, but also probably common or more common than we might want to think about. And so that means that I think being the one person to solve a problem is just not fair and probably not achievable. And so I think like thinking about cluster hires, thinking about sort of support from the existing people on the faculty that can sort of talk through like what are the real challenges or not, is helpful. And this is, I think, a lot of what happens described in the AALS report, but also I think in Mira's book and other people who have talked about these hiring challenges. I think also really understanding like what the standards are and like what the secret knowledge is that you have to know or should know, and not being trusting necessarily that the institution is going to look out for you, because institutions don't. That's not really their job, and even if they might say that they do. But I think also, I think schools have to really deeply look at how they hire and assess people. And I'll give you an example. I had some real challenges on my evaluations in the first few years that I was teaching, and people can complain. Like, I'm not saying that I'm a perfect teacher. I definitely wasn't then, and I probably never will be. But some of the complaints I think were justified, and I tried to think about that. And some of them were really ugly, and ugly in the way that you never forget. And I had such a hard time explaining to the faculty members that evaluations like are known to like really be a site of bias, and really we should be very careful about using them, even if we use them at all. I am not even a person who's expert in these areas, and it was 2018, 2019. So it's not exactly like I was saying something particularly cutting edge or incendiary, but people, they weren't like oppositional to it, but they just had never thought about it. And I found that was really draining on me as a person to try to sort of explain this, I think, pretty well-known and well-documented situation. And so that just felt like a lot of work that as a new faculty member, I think at the time I was the only junior faculty member of color on the entire Vanderbilt faculty. Like, it just felt like a lot and not fair. And not something that I should have to do affirmatively, but other people should be able to do that because it wasn't something that I had special knowledge of. And I think to their credit, they did understand that eventually, but it felt like a lot of work, especially because I also didn't feel, I hadn't really been observed a lot as a junior faculty member, and I was much more open to that. I was not opposed to being assessed or even criticized, but I felt like there was like this one very sort of narrow default way that was being done, and that didn't feel reflective or real or fair, like I said. And so those are the kinds of things that I think expertise could proactively look at. Like, how are we assessing people? What do we think is valuable? Like, what is it that, like, how are people being treated, so that it's not only on the people, it's not, the labor is not required from those who are like least able or should be least expected to give it to fix those problems.
Absolutely. Well, I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure we have time for questions for those who want to ask them. So before we open it up, I just want to thank you for that just really rich conversation and for sharing your thoughts and your work in this space. We're lucky as a community to have you as part of the charge on this.
So we should wrap up. We'll kind of wrap up and then stop the recording. If anyone wants to stay on to engage, you may. But I also just wanted to acknowledge that Gautam has class very soon. I wanted to especially appreciate him sharing his time and insight, wisdom, expertise with us while he should be preparing for class potentially and has a busy day. And I also just wanted to let you know that we did record today's conversation. So if you think there's someone else who can benefit from it, we will make it available on our website. I also just wanted to share 2 more events that we have this semester, and we'll share some links to register in the chat. On Friday, March 3rd, a little bit of a different time. Sometimes the start times are different based on people's teaching schedules, but from 12 to 1, our own tax clinic director, Professor Sakina Tillman, will be in conversation with Professor Tamika Lester of Georgia State University College of Law. They are both tax clinicians. They're going to be discussing a wide range of topics, but also thinking about how we can, in the clinic, support academic success. And then our last event this semester will be on the 17th of March with Professor Jerome Hughes, who directs our Community Economic Development Law Clinic. And he will be in conversation with 2 guests, Professor Renee Hatcher of the University of Illinois Chicago Law, and also Professor Carmen Huertas Noble from CUNY Law. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you again to Andy and Gautam for a really insightful and enriching conversation. We appreciate you and are so glad to have you in our field. Thank you.